So what I'm going to do is going to give you a bit of an insight in terms of what we've been doing in the city in terms of developing very sort of environmentally sustainable buildings. Then going to give you a quick canter through our developments to date over the last sort of 15 years. Going to pick up on kind of some of the challenges that we've faced adopting a passive house approach to our new developments. And then hopefully just give you a bit of an insight in terms of why we stick at it and why we continue adopting this approach to our development. Hopefully we'll have plenty of time at the end for some questions. If not, I know once everyone's done their presentations, by all means save your questions or put them in the chat and we can pick them up later on. So in terms of Exeter's approach to development, we very much adopt the triple bottom line approach, ensuring that all our new developments are equally socially responsible as they are environmentally and financially. We often shorten that to the 3 Ps, and all the new homes and civic buildings that we've been developing over the last decade or so have been really focused on their occupants and users as well as operators. So we've ensured that all our new buildings are very much human-centered. So they're not just great design that is fit for purpose. They're very much looking at being healthy and contributing to successful outcomes for the occupants. So for that, we want to ensure that we've got a great design. From a healthy perspective, we adopt a German biology standard, building biology standard, to ensure that we've got interventions within the design and within the fabric of the building that are conducive to the health and well-being of either the occupants or the users or operators of those buildings. From a passive house perspective, we want to produce buildings that are truly comfortable, as well as being energy efficient. And for that, we've adopted the International Passive House Standard as a tried and tested methodology. And I'll give you a little bit more insight to that in a minute. Finally, and something that's probably really at the front of most of our thinking from a council perspective has been the need for us to eradicate fuel poverty. And one of the great attributes of Passive House is that it very successfully achieves that. From a planetary perspective, all our new buildings are climate ready. By that, I mean that they are climate resilient to at least 2080. So we work with climate scientists at Exeter University, and we utilised probabilistic weather file data to ensure that the design and the way that we construct our buildings builds in that robustness, so we don't have to retrofit at a later date. We want to ensure that all our new developments are low carbon and contribute towards our drive to be a net zero carbon city by 2030. And we also want to ensure that all our new developments sit within a context that enhances biodiversity. And therefore we adopt the UK Building with Nature Standard to do that. From a profit perspective, we probably call it more sort of wealth creation in the local government perspective, or value for money. What we want to ensure is the way that we build and how we build offers us value for money from a client's perspective, and also provides both life cycle cost benefits to us as the long-term landlord of many of these assets, but also provides cost benefits to our occupants, and particularly our social tenants. And certainly we've got great evidence to support the wealth creation in our tenants by not having to pay for heating, and thereafter the benefits in our local economy because there's more available cash for those tenants to spend it in our local shops and services. So in terms of Passive House, and before I go on to giving you a whistle-stop tour of what Passive House is about, we've been building homes to this triple bottom line basis for just short of the last 15 years, starting quite modestly with our first generation Passive House, and we're now on to, I think, our 7th generation. We were very much an early adopter of the Passive House standard. Our key drivers initially was to get the council house building again after a gap of about 25 years. And we came to adopt the Passive House standard purely on our wish to eradicate fuel poverty at that time. So, and that bears no resemblance to energy costs these days. So our very first council houses that we built were part of our downsizing initiative on relatively small infill garage sites. We started them in 2008, and since then we've delivered over 200 certified Passive House council homes, and we are now in the throes of developing a further 1,000. A third of those are for open market sale through Exeter Living, which is the council's privately owned development company. And then a further 50% will be council stock for our colleagues in the housing revenue account. And then the remaining 25% being developed for build to rent, which will be retained by the council long term again. So our very first Passive House homes were at Knight's Place. Here's a photograph of that particular development, 18 apartments, and this was the UK's first multi-residential Passive House development. It was unbeknown to us at the time. We just thought it was a good idea. Since then, we've gone on to widen the scope of our development, and we've also delivered the UK's first Passive House extra care village, 53 apartments and associated accommodation. And we last week opened the UK's first Passive House leisure centre. So I think what this clearly demonstrates to you is the confidence that we have gleaned and retained in building to very high environmental and sustainability credentials. So for those of you that are not familiar to Passive House, I'm not going to bore you with the full details this afternoon. I usually like to share this image. It's a real quick and easy takeaway. If we're trying to explain Passive House, put quite simply, it's kind of the difference between a thermos, coffee flask and a percolator. The thermos coffee flask being the Passive House approach, and the percolator being the more conventional house building type, where we're relying on constant energy to keep the property warm or cool in the summer. Now, what we like about Passive House is that it's much more than an energy standard. Often people think it's just a drive to deliver homes that are cheaper to heat, but in reality for us, what we really like about Passive House is not only is it an energy criteria, i.e. it's very low energy, it also provides a high degree of comfort for residents and building users, as well as being hygienic. And when I mean hygienic, that's probably more Germanic term. From a hygiene perspective, using building physics, we're providing buildings that eradicate the incidences of condensation, mold growth, and the like. So these are, the Passive House standard is producing buildings that are really, really rigorous and robust. How does it work? Well, it's predominantly building physics. I wasn't particularly keen or indeed good at physics at school, but it is remarkably straightforward. There are several sort of key attributes that typically make up a certified Passive House building. Typically, you're looking at creating a building that is kind of wrapped in a tea cozy. So it has an inherent high level of insulation. The buildings typically are airtight. So what we're trying to achieve is a very, very low air change target. Our ultimate target is 0 air changes. The Passive House Institute allows us up to 0.6. So we're creating basically completely draft-free buildings. Now, when we talk about airtight, it doesn't mean that you're going to suffocate. Passive House buildings generally will have a mechanical ventilation heat recovery system. And that is just a simple bit of kit that you can either fit in the home or externally. And that basically extracts lots of fresh air from outside. It then filters it to remove all the particulates of pollution. And you can also filter it for pollen. That fresh air then comes into the building, and as it does so, it extracts some of the heat from the exhaust air that's leaving the building. That heat is transferred through an exchange, which means that the stale air and the fresh air don't mix. And then that warmed fresh air then is circulated through the building through a series of ducts, and typically is relatively silent. Much depends on what brand of MVHR system you buy, and that provides constant fresh air throughout the home or building. From a building physics perspective, we also pay a little bit attention to how we orientate the building. It's less vital, and often you can have difficult sites where you can't necessarily get an optimized solar orientation position. But certainly what we're trying to do is maximize the amount of free solar gain that we can use to utilize warming up our homes. Typically, we like to adopt a compact building form, not that you necessarily have to, it just drives down the costs for building passive house, because the more compact the form, the less we have to pay for in terms of surface area for insulation and the like. Other qualities, I suppose, is we install very high performance windows and doors. Typically, they'll be triple glazed. And we typically won't use plastic windows or doors because of our building biology principles. And so those windows also come with a much greater life cycle. In terms of the take-up of Passive House across the UK, well, it was relatively slow to gain traction, but I would say certainly in the last 2 years in particular, when most councils have declared a climate emergency, and I guess people's attention to climate issues has reached the forefront of thinking, there's been an explosion of new passive house buildings being developed across the UK. There's over 2,000 currently underway, and there are indeed many more in the pipeline. What I would say is, compared to the typical delivery of new homes and new buildings in the UK, it's still a very small proportion, but it's growing in momentum. Now, in terms of some of the challenges we've experienced in terms of building to these high environmental standards, I think probably early on, one of our greatest challenges to overcome was really the willingness of councillors to adopt a forward-thinking approach of better performing buildings. And indeed, I would say that that continues to be a challenge for many new clients who might be thinking about Passive House. But I think increasingly, when people will come to realise with the increased cost of energy and the climatic change implications on our buildings across the UK, it's going to be pretty foolhardy not to adopt a passive house approach, or certainly a fabric first approach, without having to be faced with mitigating certainly the need to cool our homes, particularly when we look at sort of projections of climate conditions beyond 2040 in the UK. In terms of procuring and constructing passive house, well, to be quite frank, we have all the same problems that everybody else is particularly having in this moment in time in terms of procuring any new build buildings. So I wouldn't say that from a procurement and construction perspective, passive house is any more harder, but I would say that there's probably less interest from mainstream contractors to want to build a passive house when there is such a robust marketplace, which there is at the moment. So generally speaking, contractors will probably be reluctant to tender for passive house projects if their order books are already looking particularly healthy. There's a general reluctance to fix contract values, particularly for projects that are of a duration over 12 months. And a lot of this is linked to the immense uncertainty and instability for material costs and availability of workforce. I don't think building to passive house is that much more problematic than any other building regulation compliant building at this moment in time. But often contractors will use passive house as a bit of an excuse. I think one of the other challenges is these constant myths associated with passive house, particularly the myths surrounding that it's going to be that much more expensive, that you somehow have to live differently in a passive house home and therefore expend a lot of time and resources training tenants or trying to market the ease of livability for market sale homes. And certainly those remain myths. In terms of construction design and methodology, there's lots of fairy tales about you have to build using certain materials, there's got to be a certain design and the like. One of the great things about the Passive House standard is the complete flexibility that it gives the designer. If anything, it probably gives designers more flexibility. So you can build any type of building in any geographical location, practically to any design and any type of construction methodology. Passive House is purely just a performance standard that applies to those buildings. We will typically build our low-rise homes using clay blocks, which has proven to be very cost-effective for us. And for our larger buildings, we tend to adopt a concrete frame. Now, that methodology usually relates to our weather climate resilience design and our need to adopt quite a large amount of thermal mass. I think that the other remaining challenge is probably expertise. Whilst the uptake of Passive House has encouraged a lot more designers and professional consultants to become professionally trained in Passive House, we still have a shortage of experienced consultants. We've got the advantage of having worked with consultants now in nearly 15 years, and so we have a lot of experience that we can bring in through our feedback learning loops and improve our designs each and every time. But there is still insufficient expertise and a degree of lack of experience, but that is changing at pace. In terms of finally why we remain committed to building to these environmental credentials and particularly Passive House, well, from a landlord's perspective, we've seen many life cycle cost benefits. Our tenants have experienced monumental energy cost savings, and indeed 60% of those residents in our Passive House council homes haven't needed to switch their heating on, and for some of those that's been for nearly 15 years. So that's been quite life-changing for those residents, and you can imagine, you know, today and today's energy costs, just how life-enhancing that can be for them. Having our Passive House portfolio has also allowed us to safeguard the need for future retrofit. We've got inherent built-in climate resilience, and Passive House in itself gives you a high degree of climatic resilience. And of course, we have the benefit of very high quality assured fabric, which will withstand will be much more conducive in terms of our longer term life cycle costs and liabilities. In terms of feedback from our tenants, social tenants can be less than generous in terms of feedback of any sort of council house. But certainly from the post-monitoring studies that we've done, some of which have been in excess of 2 years, there's been unanimous support from our tenants for living in a Passive House home. We've seen tenants benefit from not having to pay for heating, or if they do pay for heating, the costs are typically under £100 a year. We've seen that tenants, once they live in a passive house home, are reluctant to move. So we see far less voids, which obviously benefits us from a housing management perspective. Interestingly, we've also experienced a reduction in antisocial behaviour. Now, we don't know that's exactly as a consequence of passive house, but I think there is something to be said about developing homes that are very robust and have a high level of acoustic insulation. Certainly, you don't have the sound transfer between homes that you might have in other close-knitted estates. And of course, our tenants have seen some of the enhanced health benefits. All our homes have low levels of electromagnetic radiation. All the finishes are either natural materials such as timber, ceramic, or stone. Our longitudinal studies have shown that we've seen a reduction of people suffering from colds, flus, respiratory conditions, as well as reporting that they sleep better. And in terms of the overall business case for Exeter City Living, which is the council's wholly owned housing company, we certainly have the advantage of the value uplift of developing to these higher environmental performance factors. So typically, passive house homes can secure a premium of anything between 10 and 15%. So when you're considering that from a build cost perspective, we typically will build passive house, semi-detached and detached homes with about a 5 to 7% cost premium. For our apartments, up to about 4 stories, we are able to deliver those at 4% less than BCIS building regulation compliant. So actually we can build them cheaper. So when we're looking at our development appraisals, taking account of the marketability and sales premium, it really means that it's a no-brainer in terms of adopting these high performance standards. So
yeah, Chris Brown from Somerset Western Taunton. We're a small district authority. We're going through unitary at the moment, so next year will be a larger combined authority, and hopefully that will provide more opportunities for development. But we have got some models that I'd like to share. I'm also going to talk a little bit about retrofit, so it's going to be both on our new build and our retrofit. And 2 years ago, I was within a few days of coming down to see Emma, and with quite a few people and members to see their model. And if it hadn't been for a certain lockdown, we may well be much closer to where Emma is now as far as what we have chosen to deliver. However, we were left to our own devices, or at least a smaller circle of opportunities. So we went down the road. What we had was a number of opportunities that we were already pursuing. We have a large regeneration scheme, which was already had a contractor appointed, where we needed to build 227 units, but they were being built to standard building regs. And then we had other schemes which were just about to go through planning. So what we did, we paused for a short period of time to see if we could improve the standard. Our members very keen on climate change, reduction of carbon, CO2, etc. So there was a lot of pressure, and we were happy to absorb that pressure and use it to actually see what we could do with the schemes that we already had in pipeline. And what we did, we developed one standard, which was, all the properties we were building have to be 2050 compliant without going back to them and retrofitting again. 110 will be, will have very low levels of air tightness, what I would consider zero carbon on first let, and then another 227, which were 80% towards the thermos rather than the percolator, really. So they'd made a big stride towards zero carbon. The key difference is around air tightness, is that these 227 aren't as tight in their the way in which they're dealing with air tightness, which means that it's very difficult to make them reduce their heat demand quite as far. So those are the key differences. Otherwise, they're pretty similar. They're all using PV. They're all using battery. Sorry, not most of them are using batteries and air source heat pumps, and they do have very good levels of insulation. I also want to just touch on retrofit, because we have 5,700 properties that we manage, and our big challenge is how can we actually improve these. So we're doing some, I think, interesting work towards that. For those who are involved in retrofit, it might be a path that you're also treading, and it's familiar to you. So Seawood Way is it's on site now, 54 new dwellings in Minehead. And what we building 21 houses, quite a lot of 33 flats, and there's some properties there for wheelchair access, fully wheelchair adapted. It is in a flood zone, so we're having to build up by nearly 8 meters the ground level. So it's got some challenges there, but we all have challenges, like Emma said. And we expect to complete this by 2024. The contractor has worked with us through a PCSA agreement. So obviously Exeter City Living and Exeter City Council have a very clear specification. We have employers' requirements, but in our carbon saving element of that, we allow the contractor to propose opportunities, and we set the broad framework, and they come back with their solutions. And that's what we did with both the North Taunton schemes and the Seawood Way schemes, and they both approached it differently. So one of the key things at Seawood Way, Seawood Way, is that they use proposed Porthorn blocks. The contractor did a passive house development on the coast, the south coast, at Seaton, I think, and that was very successful using the Porthorn blocks. So we thought, you know, we agreed with their assessment that they would be worth considering. We are not putting in batteries anymore. There was a key issue there about how much reinforcement we would need in the roofs in order to hold the extra weight. So, but we are putting in the PVs, and air source pumps, smart controls, mechanical heat ventilation and such. And the air tightness target will be low, not as good as the passive house, but it's pretty good. And for this, it should significantly reduce the heat demand and therefore the amount of energy you need to actually warm the properties. I doubt it wouldn't lead to zero being spent on fuel, but it's not a bad start and a significant benefit for the customers. And then there's the odd other benefits for customers and the environment: green bike sheds, green roofs on those, electric car charging points available. So this is one approach. Now our North Taunton one varies from this. They used a more standard cavity wall approach, but with a large amount of insulation in that cavity wall and enhanced insulation in the roofs, triple glazing, etc. So the North Taunton development, of which there'll be 227 eventually, and the first ones will be complete this year. We're still expecting a significant benefit for customers, an 80% reduction in their fuel use. We can't say fuel bills now, but in their fuel use. And likewise for benefits for CO2, it's all there really. So these are two alternative approaches to the passive house. We're not challenging the passive house. Is a very good approach, which would be wonderful to follow. We had to sort of retrofit our low carbon aspirations into these schemes, and therefore I think one thing with passive house is that you have to start off with good design and with the model in mind, and we didn't have that luxury. However, we feel that the benefits that will come from these two schemes, or 300 odd properties, the models are appropriate. We are obviously conscious that there are performance gap issues, and one thing that we don't have in the same way as a passive house approach would have is that extreme or that scrutiny in the nth degree or at every stage on the development and implementation. You know, we're more reliant on making sure the clerk of work is checking out things, making sure that the modelling done beforehand is right, trying to make sure that challenges on site are managed well. But you know, we will find out whether it is a good model soon enough, and we are confident it will be, albeit not up to that passive house standard. Just switching now on to retrofit, and slightly different story here. Obviously, there are a lot of challenges with retrofit. So what we've realised is that, yeah, we've got a long way to go. So we've got out of our 5,700, nearly 2,000 are not compliant with the 2030 standard where we need to be. And we've been looking at this for a number of months now and made, I think, good progress. A key thing is that we're doing is we are looking at our decent homes investment in a different way now. So it's much more retrofit focused. We're looking at packaging decent home measures with retrofit measures. So we've got, instead of single measures like roofs or windows or kitchens or bathrooms going into properties, we're looking at the house and packages of works in a more combined way. This is challenging. I mean, I think for kitchens and bathrooms, generally they can go on as single measures, but packaging works together is something which is not familiar to us generally, so we are starting to do that. What's making us do that is that we need to introduce things like external wall insulation on a much greater scale. We have an opportunity with subsidies at the moment, especially with the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, and we want to capture this subsidy to make sure that we can afford to get to where we need to be with retrofit, not just the 2030 target, but the 2050 challenge. We have modelled our stock now, and people might be familiar with the Parity software. That's something that is a very good investment we found. There are other software models on the market, but using the Parity modelling, you know, we believe we can reduce our CO2 by 90% by 2040, and it will be as the grid decarbonises, that will increase further. So that's significant. Our challenge is the £103 million it might cost us. However, this is where the subsidy is critical, and the alignment to the Decent Home Standard is critical as well. Heat demand is how we're measuring things. So EPC is now a useful way of, you know, justifying grant and being able to prove to government that we merit receiving grant. However, it's our heat demand for properties which is driving our thinking and our strategy. So we believe that with the existing stock, we should be able to get below 60 kilowatts per metre square per year. And we think that's pretty ambitious. Not quite up to the high level of Letty, but it is pretty ambitious and a significant contribution considering the stock we've got. We believe the fabric first approach is the right approach. It will bring the greatest saving of CO2. It will substantially reduce fuel costs in a like-for-like comparison to what they were before 31st of March this year, and will ensure affordability to the HRA business plan, which is a key thing with all the other challenges we have. And we're building in a fuel poverty tipping point. So it'd be a relatively blunt tool, but there are some properties, for example, bungalows, which will find it difficult to get down on average, as an average, to the 60. Some might, some will, but others won't. So as we have more vulnerable customers in there, do we do more to actually support those customers and help them tackle fuel poverty. And I think, yes, we can. So we can do more interventions around PV, around even batteries and such, to try and do that over time. Whereas there's other properties like flats and apartments, which by their nature generally are a little bit more snug and can be made more snug. And we probably don't need to do as many additional interventions there, even though the customers might be vulnerable as well, because their purse isn't being stretched as much by the fabric of their dwelling. Key thing of our strategy is that we do have to maximise grants, and the biggest game in town will be the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund. We were successful as part of a consortium for Wave 1 with a few properties. That was very useful insight into bidding and what we are learning, and we're now extending that. So our ambition is around 400 units per year now, retrofit, low carbon retrofit. That's a big step for us, and it does mean a big change in our capital programme, applying more programme of works to properties rather than individual components being replaced. We know we're facing a lot of challenges because we've got a number of leaseholders. That worries us because we need to have all those permissions and willingness of some leaseholders to invest in their own property and their own low carbon benefits. So there are 104 flats in our stock, and we need to convince those 410 private leaseholders who are in those to see the benefits. Otherwise, it will restrict the speed and the ability of us to improve our stock. So the HRA business plan, there's 4 key areas around making it affordable. One is the integration of the low carbon and decent homes investment. Next, it's about maximising government subsidy. There are other grants around, but like I said, the biggest one is the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, and that is prioritising fabric, and we think that is the right approach for the next, probably in our case, the next 8 years, 10 years. And then efficient delivery programs. And one of the key things that we need to do is just make sure we do find every means possible, and tenants find every means possible to encourage other tenants to take part in these programs, as access will be critical and also help us deliver more efficiently. And then making sure we've got the contractors and the supply chain, and that in itself will be a big enough ask. Just a couple of things that we found. So historically, we've just done EPC, not just, but we've done EPCs as a means of seeing where we are as far as our efficiency on energy. We're moving that very much more to the parity approach, which uses EPC as one measure. What we found recently is when we did use the parity software, it straight away converted 900 of our properties, which are in band D, to band C. And it did that because it was able to capture more recent decent homes work around boilers, and that quality of information was good. So straight away we got some extra points on the SAP, and straight away we had 900 properties fewer to worry about pre-2030. They're still there to worry about, you know, as we move towards zero carbon. But it just proved the benefit of that data and that knowledge, and being able to look at things through a different, from a different perspective, really. One thing that we're doing also, we're not just relying on things like the parity software to give us a helicopter view or EPCs. We're working with a consultancy to design pathways for our properties. So we have 16 different archetypes in the district, most of those non-traditional, and most of the archetypes have got relatively few numbers. Most of ours, 80%, are traditionally built, or you know, standard cavity wall built properties. And what we've done, we've got them to look at sufficient archetypes to give us 97% coverage. So they've actually only had to look at 5 different archetypes, but they've also looked at 3 different forms within that: bungalows, flats, and houses. And for each archetype and each form, so that could be up to around about 46, 48 different pathways, there is a pathway of where that property will be, that archetype and that form will be or could be by 2050. And it tells us the type of element that we might need to change to get there, our choices. I know the Parity software does this in a different way, but this allows us to look at the pathway and a no regrets approach to say, what can we avoid doing? What must we do? And I think it comes out with key areas such as floors. For some properties, we don't need to insulate the floors. And when we're talking about that in houses, often when you're insulating floors, you're going to have to change the stairs because of the runs. You're going to have to change the carpentry, skirting, etc., and you're going to have to change the door heights. So there's a lot of investment, and then you've got the kitchens and to worry about as well. So some of our pathways are also saying, how can we avoid that problem? So for some properties, the floor is going to be critical. Do we need to do it or not? If we need to do it, then can we start doing that early through void works? Because what we don't want to do is decant customers and have that extra cost. And I think that's where a lot of the extra cost is going to come if we have to do it. But this example is showing that we can avoid it. We will still get down to 50, a heat demand of 50. That's a reasonable heat demand. And it means that extra 25 value for money would say we would avoid that. But there are other examples where we would want to go that extra mile, and we have to set up some sort of program to get us there. So this is a useful, well, I found it an extremely useful visual to actually say, how do we move towards zero carbon with the least regrets? And that's certainly coming forward in our strategy. So last slide, key things: we're aligning the Decent Homes program with the retrofit. That's the only way we can make this affordable program. We maximise the social housing decarbonisation fund in the short term, and whatever grants become available after that. So 400 per year, a lot of effort now. But those 400 a year are not focusing on today or 2030, they're focusing on what these properties need with a no regrets approach towards 2050. Like we say, the archetype studies and the archetype pathways are there to help us with a no regrets approach. And what we are trying to make sure is that we get that heat demand low enough in order to avoid fuel poverty, or at least to minimise the additional measures that we have to put in to try and support customers afford their heating for that. So quick whiz through. I know there's 2 different topics there, but happy to either take some questions.
Text practice. We kind of specialise, if you like, in low carbon housing. And of particular interest, we specialise in Passive House. So kind of picking up on what Emma's been saying. I'm an associate director there. I led on the Goldsmith Street project, which, if any of you follow the architectural or housing press, was the first social housing project to win the Sterling Prize a couple of years ago. So a kind of big pat on the back for a local authority, not just delivering housing, which is hard enough to do, as I'm sure you all know, but actually passive house housing, housing it really at the top of its game in terms of sustainability. So in terms of what's important to us, just before we get into the kind of nuts and bolts, we want to create really beautiful buildings that respond to their context, that ultimately gets planning, active and overlooked streets. So you're making good places for people to live. As part of that, there's the kind of softer stuff, which is actually creating places for children to play. You notice I've not talked about energy yet. And also, communal spaces and actually creating, a good community and places for neighbourly interaction. But ultimately, all of that can be done under an envelope of, sustainable housing. Hopefully my presentation is moving on. Is that I've got Alex on screen. Is the screen changing? I get a nod. Yeah, sorry. I just didn't want to make sure I was talking to myself. So this is just a little spread of kind of what's on the drawing board at the moment for us, just to give you a feel for where we're at in the kind of industry. And as Emma was saying, a lot of architects will say they can deliver passive house housing or low energy housing. And I think the thing we have to kind of set out our stall with is that I think it's the experience that we bring to the table that a lot of others do not have. And I think it really is a case of rolling your sleeves up and actually having delivered something that you understand all the quirks, all the difficulties, and how to actually deliver it for, the client's budget, which is where a lot of schemes fall foul. So at the moment, we're working with Milton Keynes on an 80% CO2 reduction scheme, which is 100 units in total, but we're doing 50. We're working a lot with the City of York, which I'll touch on later in the presentation. So we've got 2 schemes which are about to go into contract and start on site this summer, one for 83 units and another for 34, with another scheme about to go out to tender, which is 87 units. All of those are passive house and net zero in use on site. We've got a scheme which is currently in planning in South London for 36 units for a housing association. And then also more around Chris's way in North Somerset. We've got a scheme that's hopefully going to start on site this summer. So this has got planning for 50 units, again, certified passive house. So you can see the theme here. Passive house standard, local authorities, developing schemes that are viable and affordable. And then the scheme I'll unpack a little bit more today is our Goldsmith Street. So actually delivered. That was for Norwich City Council. That was certified passive house. But these are kind of fairly this is almost our bread and butter. They're kind of not small schemes, but 30 to 100 units. At the other end of the spectrum, we're working on master plans, which are 600 to 5,000 units. And in those cases, we're actually picking up on what Kristen's saying, actually making quite difficult decisions on actually not necessarily retrofitting, but in some cases demolishing and putting forward an argument for effectively estate regen or council stock regeneration, where actually it makes more sense to demolish and rebuild new to passive house standard rather than investing capital into retrofit. But slightly bitter pill to swallow, but actually when you look at the viability around that, it actually makes a huge amount of sense, and the kind of quality of housing you get at the end of it can be significantly better. So just to kind of take you through Goldsmith Street, which tends to be what people really want to hear about, just because we have delivered it for a local authority for a good budget. But before I do that, I'll just go into kind of why we're doing it. I won't kind of repeat what Emma was saying, because I think she's given a really good primer to everyone today as to why you should be building to passive house. But there's this little thing called the performance gap that's not so little, actually. And we had some work done post Goldsmith Street looking at the CO2, so energy use of those buildings over the next 30 years. And you can see here that if you don't build to passive house or to a kind of low energy standard, the performance gap, so the difference in reality between what the building is performing on paper versus how it's performing in reality is huge. And that just means huge heating bills for people. So what Passive House is doing, and something that Chris kind of slightly missed in his presentation, is it's giving you it's kind of why pay for that piece of paper at the end of the process. And it's the kind of almost verification that what is being built is actually what was designed. And I think there is a lot to be said for that process and making sure that we are actually building what was designed, because then you know how it will perform. And I am a massive advocate for actually making sure clients go down the certified route rather than just seeing it as another cost and an expense. And happy to take questions on that later. So what does it mean in reality? Again, it's kind of been touched on already, but what we're trying to do is bring down kind of current building regs. This has slightly moved on since this slide, or even bolting on an air source heat pump down to, really low energy use, £100 to £150 a year on average for a 2-bed house. And that's with passive house, the kind of classic standard. The challenge that we've been set by a number of clients now is how do you get down to net zero, and kind of what is net zero? And there's lots of definitions flying around about what that is. But when we're just looking at energy and use, it's basically saying all the things that you put into a building and bringing that energy use back down to zero. So mitigating it through essentially on-site renewables. Now, the trick here is to get that point down as low as you can in the first place. And that's where a fabric first or passive house approach allows you to do that. And it's kind of built in then to the design of the project. So that's almost what we did at Goldsmith Street. We had a low energy passive solar design scheme that we did actually retrofit to being a passive house scheme. It was a later addition by a client and from the client into our brief. It was 100% certified. It was low embodied carbon construction. So there's a timber frame actually hiding behind this brick skin. It was done through the local authority, developing for their own social housing. And back in 2017, we built this for 1875 a square metre. So that was very good, I think, for the quality that we got. So we've got very robust materials. You can see on this image, we've got metal guttering, kind of clay pan-tile roofs, beautiful, you know, kind of bricks, metalwork, landscaping, everything you see was done within that budget. And I think that was testament to the process we went through and our experience of working with that client to deliver Passive House for a budget. Just in terms of the project, I don't have time to probably go through the full detail today, but just conceptually, the idea was that we were reinventing the kind of terrace streets of Norwich. So looking at the local vernacular, so this was kind of 500 meters away from the site, and basically bringing it up to date. So looking at the street patterns of kind of streets and gardens and actually turning that through 90 degrees so that you've got that good solar orientation. And that is about southerly heat, so the kind of free energy from the sun that Emma was talking about, but also mitigating your overheating. Overheating there's a new Part O come out. It is the kind of secret killer for projects because you are fighting the sun. The sun is going to keep going from east to west. You want to actually kind of build into your scheme and get the master plan right, a strategy that keeps things simple. And I think that's what a lot of our schemes do. And the trick is actually how you elegantly kind of complete that on site in reality. So you can see here the kind of overall strategy is, you know, and this is what was kind of really warmly accepted by the planners of reinventing the kind of historic street patterns, but actually bringing them bang up to date. And here we have a 14-meter street and garden space, a kind of asymmetric roof form. So this is where the design kicks in now to mean that we kind of compress that site section to get as many units on the site as possible to meet the client's brief. But we did that in the form of houses, not flats. So actually a kind of family-focused, street-based scheme, mix of 2-bed and 4-bed houses. And those houses are bookended at the end of each terrace by 1- and 2-bedroom flats, so maisonette flats. So every house on this scheme has its own front door at street level, including the flats. So again, we pulled down the build cost by not introducing lifts and developing these typologies that kind of fitted the client's brief. So the other kind of key aspect of the scheme is that we've got kind of on-street parking, so very simple site works, but also then these shared ginnel spaces. So these 2 terraces share this space, and these have been the kind of things that have really enabled kind of creation of communities, residents to get to know each other, and all those good things that I said at the beginning of the presentation. So just for those of you who aren't familiar with the scheme, I'll just flick through these images just because I'm quite tight on time. But you can hopefully see from this the kind of quality of finish and robustness that we sort of built into this scheme. You know, this isn't a kind of cut out all the nice stuff to deliver Passive House. This was balancing the books to get the best out of the client's budget. And I think that's something we do really well as a practice. So it's not all about just, you know, meeting one element of the brief. It's about trying to kind of succeed in delivering all parts of the brief. This is the ginnel space that I spoke about. So, you know, the things that we designed as architects on paper, you know, actually coming into reality. And, you know, these have been really successful. We're about to do some post-occupancy evaluations with residents and actually kind of find out how they're experiencing these spaces. So we'll be able to hopefully share that soon. These are the flat typologies that we developed for the clients. So these are 1-bedroom flats stacked on top of each other. And the way they work is you have a ground floor flat entered through this kind of blue door here. And then the first floor flat, you go in the door straight up the stairs. And then the second floor flat comes in on the side and the stair hoops up around up to the top floor. Why am I telling you all this? Well, what was really good about this typology is that we cut out lifts. Therefore, we cut out the service charge for lifts. We didn't actually have to put in the lift. And actually what we created was that sense of ownership and reduction in issues from a kind of housing management point of view around communal spaces. So everyone had their own front door, their key, that was their space, they could do what they want behind the door. And I think that's been really successful as a response to the client's brief. Again, a couple of other images. And I'll just pause on this one. So one of the things that we had to do, as with all projects, you might be looking at this going, God, they had a massive budget, they could do what they wanted. We were really tight on budget. This came back over budget after tender, and we went through sort of £2.5 million worth of VE. Now, normally what that means is the contractor goes, well, let's chop this out, let's change this, let's do this, let's kind of get rid of all the nice brickwork. And we went, we don't want that to happen. So we took ownership over that process. The client trusted us to take ownership over that. And this was actually delivered under a traditional contract. So rather than design and build, traditional JCT contract. So we did have that control. We did have that kind of empowerment by the client to make those tricky decisions and actually balance the books. And the roofs are a really good example of how we did that. I think we saved over 300,000 on the roofs alone. And I think why I really like this image is it just shows how VE can still be beautiful and actually give a kind of great solution to a scheme. So what's kind of happened since Norwich is we bid on a framework for the City of York. They've got a number of sites, 600 homes coming forward, all of which they wanted to be net zero, Passive House and net zero in use on site. So kind of much more ambitious than where Norwich were. And the kind of challenge for us is how would you do that? The industry has moved on quite a lot in the last few years, and Goldsmith Street was quite groundbreaking at the time, I think, in terms of it being the largest 100% passive house, 100% social housing scheme in the UK. As Emma's saying, Exeter are doing really well, building lots and lots of passive house. I think the next step is how to get down to zero carbon, especially with all of the kind of climate targets that are coming forward now. So this is a kind of example of where we are / were. A huge amount of emissions are coming from domestic buildings. A lot of that is built up with gas, with a little bit of electricity on top. And that gas is mainly to do with water and heating. And what we need to do is, well, these aren't the actual figures. The reality is they're much higher because of that performance gap that I mentioned at the beginning. So having a build process that removes that performance gap, but also then you look at finding alternatives, which is ultimately electric, to heat water and kind of space heating. And then they need to be offset with renewables, as I was kind of saying earlier in the presentation. So, there's quite a lot to think about there in terms of how do you actually deliver that without just kind of knocking out the same old solutions, creating, responses to a site that are appropriate. And that's what we're doing. We're doing it on lots of different shaped sites. So all of these are being built to Passive House and also net zero on site. So as I say, 2 of these are hopefully starting on site this summer. A third is going out to tender in a few months. And we're also working on actually revisiting master plans that the city have had done and actually bringing them up to date in terms of their own climate targets. So York Central being a kind of key example there. But I guess why I'm kind of sort of showing you this side is that people get concerned about they don't have the right shape site or the right orientation. And I think that's where having the right architect on board and the right design team actually is critical. And yes, you might pay more for that, but actually you'll probably pay a lot less in design fees than you will in retrofitting or having increased construction costs later on down the line in the press. And I think that's a point just to take away today as well. So just a couple of examples of our York scheme. So this is Duncan Barracks. So a large kind of communal play space for adults and children in the middle. Car parking is kind of basically tucked behind me, which is why there's no cars in this image. But, we're actually kind of creating a people-focused scheme here that's all then, all built to Passive House, all net zero. And this is our Burnham project. So these are the 2 that are starting on site this summer. This also has some intergenerational living included within it as well, and our Ordnance Lane scheme as well. So that is me firing through, because I think I was only told I've got 15 minutes, so I tried to stick to that. 3 kind of takeaways that I think are really useful for everyone are, we're only halfway there. As Emma was saying, you know, I've been working on this sort of project for probably 5 to 10 years, and you know, you learn something new on every project. I think consultants starting on their first project will go through a huge learning curve. And I think what we're, you know, trying to impress on clients is that that knowledge that you're rolling into every subsequent project has a value. And I think that needs to be appreciated and understood, because, you know, especially when you're coming to look at kind of tender returns and fees, often people are always looking at the bottom line. And I think I went to a conference a kind of month or so ago that was around looking at construction costs, and there was a kind of piece done on a QS. And I thought the thing I found really interesting out of that was the cost of retrofit is 5 to 10 times what it is to build from day one. So actually, we need to stop looking at the bottom line and actually look at buildings as investments, and actually accept that, you know, you might have to spend a little bit more now, but actually it will save you in the long run. And that kind of comes into the master plan. You know, I think Chris said, you know, a lot of local authorities are kind of working with schemes that have been on the table for a number of years. And that for me is a big no-no. You know, the master plan is probably the critical thing to creating an economic route to delivering passive house or low carbon homes. Because again, we're coming back to the sun here. It's always going in the same way. And I think a lot of schemes are fighting the sun. It's just not worth it. It adds more cost. You can't deliver schemes to a budget. And it's paramount to get that master plan right. And then last of all, you know, it doesn't need to cost the earth. Bit of a kind of cheesy last one there. But I think the point there is that actually balancing quality around construction materials, longevity, looking at whole life carbon cycles, you know, actually putting that money in upfront in the build costs actually can save you in the long run. And that's me done. So happy to take any questions.